Okay, hello everyone, and welcome to this week's Information Studies 650 lecture. So this week we'll be talking about digital preservation. To survive, you must change. All right, so here are our weekly topics for this week. What is digital preservation? What are the major issues associated with preserving digital information? What are some methods for preserving digital information? And how has the evolution of digital preservation been influenced by analog preservation? Okay, so here we have kind of a brief definition of digital preservation from the Harvey and Mahard article for this week. So just to highlight a few things, we have the word action and intervention, which is quite different from when we discussed regular preservation earlier on in this course, which we described as being mostly a passive activity. And as we'll discuss later on in this lecture, digital preservation involves much more involvement by archivists in the preservation of digital records. But otherwise, you can see some similarities between digital preservation and analog preservation. We'll talk more about those later on, but we're talking about ensuring continued and reliable access, so similar to analog preservation. Mentioning authenticity, so trying to provide researchers with a record that is authentic and resembles, at least to some degree, the original form or the original state of the record as close to its creation as possible. We'll also talk about some of the ways that archivists go about doing this with electronic records. Okay, so we'll start off by talking about some general goals of digital preservation. So we talked about some overall goals, so ensuring accessibility, providing access to at least reasonably authentic records, but we'll focus a little bit more on some of the goals for digital preservation. Okay, so again, there's definitely a focus on accessibility and usefulness. And one of the ways that a record can be useful is if researchers are able to assess the reliability and the authenticity of a record. If researchers are unable to do that, then depending on the information need that the researcher has, that record may not be of use to them. They may not be able to have as much confidence in it as they need to include it in their thesis or publication or whatever else it is that they're working on. So obviously it's important that researchers are able to determine how reliable and how authentic the record that they're looking at is. So an important part of providing researchers with the ability to assess the reliability and authenticity of a record is by capturing and preserving the metadata about digital records. So this metadata ideally will convey to researchers any changes that the record has undergone and thus potential challenges to the authenticity of the record that they are looking at. So this metadata may include things like technical details, the provenance of the record, some contextual information needed to interpret the record. So that can really, as we've talked about in this class, make records more useful than if this information is missing. The fixity of the record, which is information that indicates whether or not a record has changed since it was created or changed since it entered archival custody. And we'll look at an example of fixity later on. And not only is it necessary to capture and maintain preservation, but a big part of digital preservation is the preservation of a record's significant properties. And this is something that the Headstrom article discusses on pages 160 to 161. So they discuss significant properties, or they define significant properties as being features, attributes, or properties that impinge upon future use and understanding. So aspects of a record that are essential for someone to come along and understand what that record is and what that record was used for. And the Headstrom article states that these properties warrant ongoing preservation because they contribute so much to the appearance of an object, the ability to interpret the object, or the ability to use a digital object. So these are really important aspects of a record that need to be preserved in order to make records useful for researchers, which again is the goal of preservation as a whole. One interesting thing to note is that significant properties are not fixed, and they're really determined by the archive preserving the records based on an understanding of why the record was created and how it was used. And another important consideration is who is going to be using the records that the archives are preserving, and what might they consider to be the significant properties of a record? What do they need to have preserved within a record in order for that record to remain authentic and useful for them? And we'll talk a little bit more about how archives can think about significant properties later on in the lecture. So essentially, archivists need to preserve not only the information itself, not only the content of the record, and more specifically the significant properties of that content, but also the ability to render information in a meaningful way. And so there's a need to preserve not only the content itself, but the metadata that provides details about the content to researchers, which researchers can then use when making a determination about if and how to use digital records that an archive has preserved. So next we'll look at some of the overlaps between analog and digital preservation. And the Harvey and Mahard article has a really excellent table on page 10, which provides a list of some different attributes and some different considerations related to both analog and digital preservation. So for instance, Harvey notes that appraisal is necessary and desirable for both analog preservation and digital preservation. We've talked a lot in this course about the need for appraisal with electronic records. The Harvey article also notes that in both instances, preservation actions should be documented. That's especially true for digital preservation, and this documentation will come in the form of metadata. The preservation action should not harm the object, so that's a pretty important consideration for preservation overall. So we can see quite a bit of overlap between specific aspects of digital preservation and analog preservation as well. And the Harvey article goes into a lot of detail about the connections that they see between the two. But it's also important to note that there are a lot of differences between digital preservation and analog preservation as well. So a big one, or two big ones, are the resources and the expertise required to conduct digital preservation can be quite different from the resources and expertise required for analog preservation. So digital preservation can require knowledge of how to use software. It can require knowledge of metadata. It can require software, which analog preservation typically doesn't. So just the infrastructure required for digital preservation is typically quite different from what an archive will need for analog preservation. As I touched on before, digital preservation requires more active management. And we'll talk about what some of those active management steps are later on. But when we discussed preservation, we talked about how it was typically a pretty passive process, and you would just put something in a climate-controlled room, and generally speaking, that was pretty good for a long period of time. But digital preservation requires more active interventions by archivists. And another difference, which I've already touched on, is the information required to be maintained. So with digital preservation, archivists are required to maintain information like fixity information, which can provide researchers and archivists with an understanding of how the record has changed over time. So the metadata that is associated with digital preservation is quite different from any notes about preservation activities that might be associated with analog records and their preservation. So if something gets sent to the conservation lab, then you might make a note of that in the fine aid or some way to make researchers aware of that. With a digital record, that information is going to be contained in metadata that is directly attached to the record, and researchers can learn more about the preservation actions that have been taken for a record in that way. So there are definitely some similarities in the principles and the ideas behind both analog and digital preservation, but there are some important distinctions as well. To learn a little bit more about digital preservation and to also think about some of the ways that digital preservation is different from analog preservation, I have this levels of digital preservation chart that the National Digital Stewardship Alliance has created. And it just shows some of the different aspects of digital preservation and conveys how archivists might really succeed at meeting some of these different functional areas related to digital preservation. So storage is something that is required for both analog and digital preservation. So stable storage, which we talked about as being important. You want to know where all of your content is stored. That's probably true for both. Having two complete copies in separate locations, that's probably going to be less likely to occur for analog preservation than digital preservation, so that might be a difference. So you can start with just knowing your content and then go all the way up to level 4, where you sustain your content. So you have 3 copies in geographic locations, each with a different disaster threat. You have different types of storage to avoid single points of failure. So you might have some of your information on servers. You might have some of your information stored in different ways. You have some kind of plan to execute actions to address obsolescence of storage hardware, software, and media. So these aren't things that you really have to consider with analog preservation. Integrity isn't as much of an issue with analog preservation as well. So electronic records can change very easily. So it's important that archivists are able to demonstrate the integrity of these changes by being able to record them and provide that information to researchers. So typically with analog records, you're not really going to verify that integrity information has been provided with the content when you get it from a donor. You're just going to say, okay, it looks like maybe this is a little fragile, but that's good enough. You're not really going to worry about verifying integrity information when you move or copy an analog record. You don't really have to worry about things like write blockers. You aren't necessarily going to be interested in performing an audit of integrity information on demand. So again, some similarities, but with digital preservation, a lot of this stuff is much more complex and much more interactive than an archivist typically would do for analog preservation. You can see the content is really focused on file formats and other essential content characteristics. So that might be something that's related to both types of preservation. But with digital preservation and the impact that the format that a record is on and how that can impact the record, there is more of a need to monitor for obsolescence with file formats and changes in technologies on which content is dependent. With analog records, if things are on paper or on film stock, you don't really have to worry about obsolescence or changes on technology quite as much as you do with digital preservation. And obviously with analog records, you're less likely to perform things like migrations, emulation, and other activities that can ensure the content can be accessed. Maybe to a certain degree, say if you take things off of an obscure type of film and put it on a more accessible type of film, but typically that's going to be done less commonly than it is with digital preservation. So just to provide some more information about the things that digital preservation is concerned with and how digital preservation differs from analog preservation, this chart does a pretty good job of portraying that. Another interesting thing to look at when you're talking about digital preservation and the different things associated with it is the OAS model that the Miliusin article mentions and that I have here. So as the Miliusin article notes, this is only a model. It's just meant to provide a framework and vocabulary for discussing digital preservation, and it's not really intended to be a blueprint for a digital preservation system, and it doesn't really outline any specific procedures, but it still gives you a good overview of what digital preservation can look like and some of the different things that are associated with it. And we'll come back and look at this diagram off and on throughout the lecture. So I know it might look a little confusing and overwhelming now, but we will go back through and dig into this some more. So to talk a little bit about the challenges related to electronic records, and I've touched on these a little bit already, but just to kind of review them, and we'll discuss some of these off and on throughout the lecture. But according to the Harvey article on page 9, electronic records exist in a large variety of types or formats that may become obsolete. So this is something that the Huth chapter also mentions, how there are just so many different formats of electronic records out there, and some of them may become obsolete, and it may be very difficult to access that information simply because of the format that the record is on. Electronic records may also be closely linked to software and hardware, which may also become obsolete. So the software used to render a file in a particular format may no longer exist or may be very difficult to find and use. If electronic records are on a hard drive or something and it's difficult to get the records off of that hard drive because the hard drive is obsolete, then that may be a problem too. Electronic records are easy to corrupt, so really by just opening an electronic record, you can change particular aspects of it. And electronic records are generally poorly identified, so they may have file names that just don't really give archivists a lot of information about what the content of the record is, or contextual clues as well. As we noted before, digital records require more frequent preservation attention than analog records, so archivists just can't sit back and let things ride. They have to be more involved with preservation. There may be a lack of developed infrastructure for digital preservation. Just because it takes more resources, it may be more difficult for archives to have the infrastructure to support this ongoing active involvement with digital preservation. And it may be difficult for archivists to have sustainable funding for the preservation of electronic records. That's really true with a lot of things that archives do. And this might be less true today because there is more of an awareness of the importance of digital preservation, but it's still an issue. Okay, so next we'll talk a little bit more about digital preservation metadata. So here are some of the things that digital preservation metadata can and should include. So there are a lot of different metadata standards out there, and there are a few different programs that produce preservation metadata. So all these might not be present in every metadata standard and retrievable through every tool. But it is important that preservation metadata tell an archivist or a researcher what the format of the record that they're looking at is. It is important that it conveys in some way some of the significant properties of a record. It's important that researchers know what environment the records were used in. So what software was used for the record, and just some information related to that. It's important that metadata conveys a record's fixity. So whether or not a record has undergone changes since it came into the repository. Preservation metadata may include technical metadata, which just gives more information about the technical aspects of the file as well. Preservation metadata should convey some sense of the provenance of the records, so who created them and where they came from, which is important for authenticity purposes, and also packaging. So what's the structure of the hard drive or the server space that the records came from. So to show an example of what preservation metadata can look like, this is preservation metadata created or produced by a tool developed by the United Kingdom's National Archives. It's called Droid. I can't remember off the top of my head what Droid stands for. But this metadata provides some of the information that we were just looking at. So we have information about the file format over here, and then some additional information saying how this file format was identified. So this is just kind of an internal numerical code that Droid uses to represent particular formats. And then it also talks about, or mentions Adobe PDF, TIFF, and so on. So there are some good things for format identification. There isn't as much information about the significant properties of this record. So that's kind of a shortcoming with Droid. We do have some information about the environment of use. So these PDFs were created by Adobe Acrobat version 1.4. This was created by, looks like Microsoft Word from 2007 onwards. So you get a little bit of information about the software that created these records, which might be important for researchers to know. This right here is a hashtag that demonstrates the fixity of a record. So what Droid does is it goes through and it assigns a numerical hashtag to every record based on the bit stream of a record, and then it spits that out. And so if you were to say, 3 months later, go back and run these records through Droid again, if there was some change between when this was done and when you were scanning the records, this would be different. You would get a different hashtag, and Droid would say, okay, there's a problem here. This hashtag was X and now it's Y. And so that would let you know that something had changed with your record. And if it's not because of something that you as an archivist did, then that would be a cause for concern. So these hashtags are a really good way to be able to tell if there are changes going on within your records. And again, ideally it's because you migrated the records or because of some action that you took, but it may be because of reasons that you don't really know or you don't really identify, and that's something that you want to look into because you don't want to have unwanted and unexpected changes going on with your records. Because again, over time that can impact the authenticity of the record. Looking at provenance, this does say that these records came from my OneDrive, and then a little bit more information about where the records came from. So that can be used for provenance. We have some dates when the records were created. So obviously, if I wasn't working with SOAS in 2017 and they said 2017 for the creation date, then someone would be like, okay, well, he wasn't working there until 2018. So did these records really come from Sean, or did they come from someone else? And then packaging. So here we have the R projects folder, and then these are all the files that are contained in that specific folder. So it just gives the researcher a little bit more information of how the files were organized when they were brought into the archive, and when this scan was done, and when this information was created. So a researcher could go back and say, okay, well, I see that this was arranged in this way when the records came in, and now it's arranged in a different way, so I'm aware that that change has occurred. So overall, this metadata is pretty good. It can give researchers a good sense of some of the important aspects of the record, and can make them aware of changes that may have occurred to the record over time, especially through fixity and especially through some of this packaging information. So if we go back to our OAIS model, the preservation metadata is going to be included in this preservation description information. And so this is something that you're going to want to have attached to the content of your record throughout the time that a record is being, or from the time when a record is being brought into the archive to when the archives are performing different preservation planning and administrative tasks related to the record's preservation. So this would describe any changes that the record that happened to the record, and then this would be the preservation metadata that the researcher would have access to. So just to kind of show you how preservation metadata fits in with digital preservation and within the OAIS reference model. Okay. So I just want to touch on the idea of preservation as existing in a continuum and not in one finite step that a record goes through. So obviously records are preserved in some form before they even enter into an archive. And because of the continuous interactions that an archivist has with electronic records when preserving them, it's something that continues on into the future as well. It's not just done once and then an archivist says, okay, good enough. It is something that needs to be repeated over and over and over. So fixity checks need to be done periodically, and archivists need to take steps to make sure that they're aware of any changes going on with their records. Again, that's just important information to provide to the archives and to researchers as well. And so as you've talked about in this class, especially with digital preservation, there is a strong need for archivists to work with records creators to make sure that when records come into archives, they do have the preservation metadata attached to them as much as possible, and that they have been maintained in a way that hasn't undermined the significant properties of the records. So it's important for archivists to take steps to make sure that the electronic records that arrive at archives are usable and can be used by researchers in the future. So again, this goes back to the idea of appraisal being more of a continuum activity as well, and the need for archivists to again just work with records creators to make sure that that records are being taken care of in an acceptable manner. So this is true for both digital preservation and analog preservation, but just because of the nature of electronic records and how easily corruptible they are and how inaccessible they can be over time if they're not on good file formats, it just becomes more important for archivists to intervene at an earlier time period to make sure that the preservation of electronic records is being addressed. So ideally, you want the information contained in the submission information package, which is what the records creator is going to give to the archive to be as complete as possible. So you want to have content that has been preserved well and that has the significant properties of the record preserved well. And then you also want to intervene to make sure that this metadata associated with the record is strong and is meaningful and useful to the archive and the researcher also. If you don't, then these two can be in quite poor condition, and that's going to impact what the archive has to work with and ultimately what the researcher has to work with in the future. So next I want to step back just a little bit and talk about digital stewardship. And so this is something that the Harvey article and the Muliuson article talk about. So on page 6 in the Harvey article, they talk about how with digital preservation, it's also more and more likely that the words curation and stewardship are going to be used because typically people associate preservation with physical objects. And as we've talked about, preserving digital records can be somewhat different than that. So Harvey describes curation and stewardship as something that allows a wider view of preservation. So terms that mean more than a set of technical processes that don't really have much connection to the services, policies, and stakeholders. And also terms that take into account the wide range of stakeholders really across the disciplinary boundaries that have some stake in the accessibility of electronic records. So Harvey mentions libraries, archives, museums, funding agencies, government bodies, national data centers, institutional repositories, just society as a whole. They're all impacted by decisions made surrounding the preservation of digital records. You could say the same thing about the preservation of analog records, although given the magnitude of digital records being created today, especially as compared to analog records, you could argue that preserving electronic records has become much more important, simply because so much of our knowledge and understanding of society is represented in electronic records. So some of the different considerations that come into the stewardship of electronic records are mentioned in the Muliusin article. So the authors talk about the need for management, so things like documentation to support digital stewardship and digital preservation, the human resources element, so making sure that archives have staff with the appropriate skills to preserve electronic records. And again, these skills may be quite different from analog preservation. Another important consideration is technology, so the different types of hardware and software that are required for digital preservation, storage, which we touched on, and storage for electronic records can be quite different from storage for analog records. And finally, the content itself. So having content that is of good quality, that has the significant properties that researchers are looking for, and content that is also accessible and usable because it has quality metadata attached to it. So one form of documentation that might be included under this management aspect of digital stewardship is having a digital preservation policy. And so here are some things that might be included in a digital preservation policy. So this is from the Essay Accessioning and Ingest of Electronic Records workshop. So a digital preservation policy might define the responsibilities and obligations of the archivist, so standards that the archive wants to meet. It may have a definition for the content and metadata that archives are seeking to preserve, and more generally, it will address levels of preservation that the archive is seeking to meet, different preservation strategies and procedures that the archive will engage in. It'll provide information about how archives are going to handle duplicates and separations, and what archives are going to do with the physical media that electronic records may come on. So if electronic records come to the archive on a hard drive, what do you do with that hard drive once you've copied the records off of the hard drive? And as the Muliusin article notes, having this information can be really helpful for archives because it can demonstrate an understanding of the different digital preservation issues that archives can face, and it's something that an archives can point to and say, look, we're doing our due diligence. We really are aware of what what digital preservation requires, and we have a plan for how we're going to address these different issues and considerations that we have to make. So to go back to our OAIS reference model, your preservation policy is something that would be included here, either in the administrative section and within preservation planning as well. So your administration would develop a plan or a policy, and that would be included in your preservation planning. So this would document all the steps that would take place during the ingest of electronic records, during the management of the data related to electronic records, how they are going to be stored, how they are going to be accessed, and just providing some of the particulars that this model kind of glosses over. Another thing that a preservation policy might indicate is whether an archives will focus on migration for electronic records, or if it will attempt to focus on emulation, which are two of the main preservation strategies that archivists will engage in. So we'll spend just a little bit of time talking about those. So we'll start with migration. So as the Headstrom article notes on page 161, migration involves the periodic transfer of data from an obsolete computing platform, medium, or format to current platforms, media, or formats. And this is done so that records are contained on a format that is more accessible for researchers. So you might be taking a record that is an original format, which may be obscure or obsolete, and you're migrating it so it's on a migrated format that is much more accessible and is easier for researchers to interact with. One of the downsides of migration is that, as Headstrom notes, it almost always changes the original bitstream of the record, and it can have a significant impact on the appearance and performance of preserved digital objects. So when you move from one format to another, it can really change the look of a record, or the feel of a record, or the sound of a record. And this can be problematic if the look and feel and sound of the record are some of the significant properties that we talked about before. So when you engage in migration, you are really sacrificing authenticity for accessibility. And it's important that researchers know that. It's important that they know that what they're looking at isn't necessarily an authentic replication of the record in its original format, and that there has been this transformative process which has changed some of the attributes of the record that they're looking at. What many archives will do is they will make a copy of the record in its original format, and they will migrate one of those copies and use that as an access copy, and they will keep the other copy in its original format. So there is at least some copy of the record in its original format out there, unchanged, untouched, that if a researcher really wants to look at the most authentic version of a record, and if it's possible for archives to provide that access, whether now or in the future, then there's still that option, because some version of this record in its original format continues to exist. But typically, accessing these can be quite difficult, and so it is a lot easier to update the format of a record and provide that updated copy to researchers to work with. So to talk a little bit more about migration and some of the properties that can be lost in migration, I have a screenshot here of a digital collage that I made. Now, this was some time ago, so my collaging skills have improved a little bit since I made this, but this is what the file would look like in its original format. So as a Photoshop document, so a .psd file. And this is what a researcher would see if this was changed to a JPEG, so just a typical image file. So while the researcher might have pretty much uh, the same colors and the same image, what they are losing out is on some of this information over here, which really talks about the structure of this collage, the different elements of this collage, what was done to some of these different elements. And, you know, for some researchers, this could be really significant information. This could be a significant property of this record that is lost when it's migrated into a more accessible form. So Photoshop is a proprietary format. Not every archive is going to have the ability to provide access to records in this format. So for accessibility purposes, they're probably going to migrate it to something like a JPEG, which can be viewed by pretty much everyone. But again, with that transformation, you do lose this information. Now, whether this information is important to researchers or not will probably depend on a variety of factors, and we'll talk about some of those later on in this lecture. Okay, so next we'll talk about emulation. So in emulation, uh, the record that a researcher is interacting with is going to be quite similar to the record in its original format, because this emulation process allows this record to be accessed in an emulated environment, which has much of the same look and feel and sound as the record did in its original state. So one benefit of emulation is that it allows researchers to interact with a record that is much more authentic than with migration. And again, that's something that researchers might be particularly keen on doing. This is especially true for people who play video games. So emulation is huge in video gaming, and a person may not have a Super Nintendo to play a video game on, but if they can emulate a game so that they're capable of playing it on their PC or on their laptop, then they're still getting much of the same look and feel of the record, but the record is much more accessible than it was if it was just stuck on one format that people may not have access to anymore. So emulation does have some advantages as far as providing a more authentic experience for the record, because more of these significant properties remain unchanged, and there aren't as much concerns with authenticity as there are with migration. Emulation can be more expensive for archives to engage in, so that is one barrier towards emulation. And sometimes it's just not clear whether or not researchers are even interested in emulation. So that's the reason why archives are sometimes less keen to engage in this type of activity. So the choice between migration and emulation really goes back to something that we talked about earlier on in this class. Is there a preference for archivists to maintain just the information contained within a record, or is there a desire to preserve the original format or something as close to the original format as possible? And some of the reasons why archives choose to go down one path or the other, why they may choose to engage in migration, which is much more focused on preserving the information contained within a record, as opposed to emulation, which is more focused on preserving the original format of the record, can take into account a few different considerations. So one that I've already touched on is the needs of researchers. So and this is something that the Hetzrom article mentions. If researchers have a need for records that are as authentic as possible because of the use of their research or the use that they're going to make of these records, then that's something that an archive may consider. If a researcher is in the late stages of their research, and because of that, they do need more authentic records, that might be another consideration as well when choosing between emulation and migration. Another big consideration is the ability of the archives. Emulation takes a much more developed technical infrastructure. It takes staff and experience with more technology skills than migration does. So it may be that archivists don't engage in emulation simply because they don't have the resources to do so. Another consideration to make is the nature of the record or the records. So if the content of the record is thought to be particularly important, or the evidential value of the record is thought to be particularly important, then that may lead in archives to try and emulate the records and provide the most authentic experience, as opposed to migrating them and risking some of the changes that that occur when records are being migrated. Another question is, why not do both? Why not have some records that are migrated, say maybe 90% of your records, and try and emulate the other 10% of your records that you feel are particularly important, or you feel are going to be used by researchers who have strict authenticity requirements. So it kind of goes back to the MPLP idea of being flexible and thinking about permanence of records in different ways, and applying different levels of permanence to, or not permanence, different levels of authenticity to different records based on some of these characteristics. But at the end of the day, the important thing is that researchers know what has been done to the record that they're looking at. So if there have been migrations that have taken place, then they need to know that so they can take that into consideration when they are carrying out their research. So really this choice is a mix of a value judgment about the content evidential of particular records, and also just kind of a practical decision that archives have to make. So when you are thinking about preserving the original format, you have to kind of take this balance into mind. So the value of the researchers versus the difficulty of preserving records or providing access to records in their original format. And again, how this equation weighs out might depend on some of the criteria that we have discussed before. If a record has a lot of value to researchers in its original format, then you might be willing to ignore some of the difficulty in providing access to the record in its original format. Again, it's going to vary from record to record and from archive to archive, and maybe from archivist to archivist as well. So the overall idea is that if archivists engage in emulation, then there may not be many differences between what the researcher originally submits to the archive for, or what the creator originally submits to the archive for preservation, and what the researcher ultimately interacts with. So this content information may be quite similar because researchers are working with an emulated environment that really recreates the environment the records were originally produced in. If records are migrated, then this content may be quite different from this content. and that can have some of the problems and considerations that we discussed. So when you're looking at permanence and digital preservation, and you're looking at the decision between migration, which again is focused on preserving the information of the record and presenting the record in its original format or as close to its original format as possible, Harvey argues that the preservation of digital materials needs to focus on their content. So this is going to be by far the most common choice that archives are going to make because of some of the reasons that we have talked about before. So two strategies that can result in researchers interacting with records in a way that may be very similar to how they were created or may be quite different. And again, just the key thing is to document these changes, make sure that you have some chain of custody that researchers can look at so that they're aware of any changes that have occurred to the record over time. Okay, so we will call it a day there. So I hope that this has helped you contextualize digital preservation a little bit. Again, in some ways, it was review some of the things that we talked about when we discussed analog preservation, but with some key differences. And I hope that you are just more aware of some of the considerations and issues that archivists have to navigate when preserving digital records. It's a huge issue that archives are still trying to figure out just because of the resources involved. It's one that not every archive does very successfully. But obviously digital records are here to stay, and it's important that every archives is able to carry out digital preservation in a way that does meet the needs of the archives and of the researchers and society as a whole as well. Okay, so have a great week. Please let me know if you have any questions, and take care of yourselves.